Hey, well, welcome to the webinar. My name is Kurt Stocker, and I'll be the moderator here today. And the subject is Legacies of the Vietnam War that have to do with things you carry with you forever. And it's like Agent Orange and PTSD, and I'm the poster child for all of that. We're going to start with Ron Carver, the curator of the Waging Peace in Vietnam exhibit. And he's going to introduce us to a gentleman from Vietnam who's going to appear in a film that has to do with exactly what we're talking about.
Thanks, Kurt. Good to be with everyone here tonight. I first met Ho Van Lai 7 years ago this month, in October 2016, when I was in Vietnam for my first time. Went to Quang Tri province, to Long Ha, to the visiting center for Project New, in their efforts at bomb clearance. And I think that one of the most moving parts of that experience and that trip was meeting Ho Van Lai. He was in his early 20s then. As you'll see from this movie, he lost both legs and an arm, was blinded in one eye when he was playing with a small cluster bomb, an anti-personnel bomb that he and his cousins found in the sand. And people might ask, well, why would he have picked up a bomb? Good question. So I wanted today I brought one with me that you could see. And you could see that the reason he was likely to pick this up, he and his cousins, is because it's about the size of a baseball. Now, this is a replica because I didn't want to bring a real bomb in the airplane with me. So it's made out of wood. So he and his cousins found 3 of these in the sand by the water, because that's near where he was living. And so what happens is they come down. There's still hundreds of thousands of these that litter the countryside. And sometimes the winds will blow the sand away, the earth away, and they come. And they were playing with them, and he banged a couple together, not knowing that they were bombs, and exploded, killed 2 of his 3 cousins, and left him so badly injured. And what he said to me when I met him there, is we just happened to be there the same day at a visitor center. He said, do you think I can have a productive life? And I was very moved by that. And of course, I had no way to answer him. But I put that quote in a little story about him in the companion book to the exhibit that we have next door at the Moreland Library in the underground gallery there. Well, I was back in Vietnam this past March, and I went back to the visitor center. And the good news is he was there again, but this time he was there as an employee. And he's employed now to go out to the schools and give talks to students in grade school in particular. And he gives talks to students when they come to the visitor center about, it's called risk education. He's a risk education specialist. I saw him give a talk there, and it was so impressive, and he was so effective, and he does it with such confidence and joy, and to make the kids feel comfortable, because obviously it's a tough, brutal thing to be talking about, and it could be tough to see him, except he's there and all his sincerity. So with that as enough of an introduction, this what you're going to be seeing is a video that was produced by the Irish Embassy in Vietnam. And it's an effort because the Irish Embassy, the Irish government, along with the British government and the US State Department now, and the Norwegian government are all spending tremendous amount of money. Susan can tell you more about that later. Susan Hammond will be speaking later in this program to pay for the clearance. The work is close to 300 employees of Project Renew involved daily, going out there, searching, finding, and then detonating safely these bombs and landmines. So let's see. Short movie, 5 minutes.
There were up to 8 million tons of bombs dropped on Vietnam. An unknown number of bombs is still buried deep in the ground in Quang Tri province, once the demilitarized zone during the Vietnam War.
Every week in the newspaper or on TV, there was an article about somebody getting killed, somebody losing a leg or an arm or losing their eyesight because of an explosion from cluster bombs, bombies, or from artillery shells or rockets. And I thought, how can this be? So many years after the war, people still being killed and injured by explosive ordnance.
Đó là vào tháng 6 năm 2000 thì lúc đó em mới 10 tuổi. Sau vụ nổ rồi thì em thấy cơ thể của bản thân rất là nóng, rồi mùi tanh của máu, rồi cả mùi thuốc súng nó hòa quyện lại với nhau thành một cái mùi rất là khó chịu.
When the night begins to fall, when you hear the siren call,
in Mr. Lai's case, I have great admiration for Mr. Lai because what he has been through at such a young age has been really difficult for him. And I think it's fantastic that he is giving back to mine risk education to prevent, as a victim himself, to prevent other victims from perhaps suffering the same consequences that he did. And I think that brings it all full circle in terms of preventing rather than curing.
Tôi có một người con rất giúp đỡ cho người mẹ tàn tật. Con bây giờ bố làm được dự án bom mìn. Sau này là khởi đi hết bom mìn là trẻ em bây giờ lớn lên không có bập vài sự đau khổ như tôi nữa.
Tôi đang làm việc với các bạn giao sắp đến khu vực ra này.
Renew và NPA đóng góp vào cái nỗ lực giải quyết cái hậu quả bom mìn, đặc biệt là giúp cho tỉnh Quảng Trị đạt được cái mục tiêu là làm trở thành một cái tỉnh đầu tiên ở Việt Nam mình an toàn khỏi tác động của bom mìn chiến lược vào năm 2025.
Yes, have been zero bomb and mine accident happened in Quang Tri over the past 3 years. We are very happy about that, but we will be happier when we can continue bringing more opportunity to the affected people to help change their lives.
We're involved with Project Renew because it fits very well with some of Ireland's priorities. Firstly, about helping those people in need, the most vulnerable, and many of those people live here in Quang Tri province, in remote and disadvantaged areas.
It is not enough just to talk about a peaceful life. You must have faith in it. And it is not enough to have faith only. You must take action for it.
Well, that's pretty interesting. And I think it's ironic that when the United States troops were fighting in Vietnam, there were booby traps set all over by the VC. And now that we're gone, it's booby traps that were left by us. And I will tell you, walking around in the jungle was one of the scariest things in the world, even if they weren't shooting at you, because you could trip one of those things any second. There's a story in my life that has to do with my son, who, when he was about 12 years old, had a friend visiting, and they set up a bunch of tripwires in the basement. And then they made a bunch of noise, and I came downstairs and tripped one, and it pulled a pin that was sticking out of the wall, and it shot right past my ear, and I went straight to Vietnam, straight to a flashback. I don't think Tyler ever saw me as mad as I was that night. But that's just something that is left. It was there in the beginning, and it's going to be there for years and years. And next, we're going to hear from Heather Bowser. And Heather's with us by remote control. And Heather is the daughter of the U.S. Army. Pardon?
It's Heather just laughing.
Heather's the daughter of a U.S. Army veteran who served in Vietnam from 1968 to 1969. And she was born with multiple birth defects in 1972. Her parents, Bill and Sharon, became aware of the chemical defoliants used during the war and became activists seeking the truth about the effects of the chemicals on veterans and their families. Heather followed in their footsteps decades later. She founded Children of Vietnam Veterans Health Alliance in 2012. And she's worked to bring answers and build community with other adult children of American Vietnam veterans and their counterparts in Vietnam. So we will hear now from Heather remotely. Heather Bowser.
Hi, everyone. Hello. It's really interesting to visit Colorado so remotely. So hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here this evening, and I appreciate the invitation. So today I'm going to talk just a little bit about myself and my journey with Agent Orange and my family's journey with Agent Orange, and then kind of just wrap up into where I feel things are, particularly for myself at this point, and in my own fight for justice for those affected by Agent Orange. So most of you, I'm hoping at this point, understand what Agent Orange is, and but I will just really quickly discuss that really fast. Agent Orange was a chemical defoliant that was used in Vietnam to kill the vegetation around bases, to kill large swaths of area of vegetation in the jungle, to disrupt food supply, although that is kind of controversial, but that is what was being done. They were using it to destroy food sources so that the enemy could not have food. So the chemical Agent Orange is almost like Roundup, and we see this a lot in American suburbia, where you have a few weeds in your lawn, you take this outside, you spray it on there, and then it kills the weeds, and those things are pulled out or whatever. Now imagine this on, you know, major steroids. There were so many gallons of this chemical that were sprayed all over Vietnam from the DMZ down. And that includes our own service members, water and food supplies. So in that way, that many of our own American veterans were also exposed to Agent Orange. So there's lots of controversy talking about how Agent Orange affected people. And at first, when veterans were starting to think that maybe there was something wrong, because when they would come home or when they would have children, they were having these issues, there was a lot of denial. Lots and lots of denial from the government, and actually painting veterans as being crybabies, as being drug abusers, and not that this chemical wasn't really the problem. But as time went on, we started to understand and realize that Agent Orange was toxic. It has so much chemical in it that is so destructive to the human structure that it destroys life. My father described it as if a plant would grow up, because they sprayed it around his face in around Long Fin, where he was stationed almost every day, and he would explain it as the plant would grow up really quick and then die. And that's really what started to happen within veterans, especially when they were coming home. My parents had decided to have, wanted to have a large family. And when my father came home from Vietnam, they started trying to have children. And unfortunately, my mother suffered 2 miscarriages before me. And then I was born in 1972, 2 months premature. I weighed 3 pounds, 4 ounces. And I was missing my fingers, my big toe on my left foot, and my right leg below the knee. And at that point, there were no ultrasounds, those kinds of things. So it was quite a shock for me to arrive anew. And they basically told my parents that if they're that messed up on the outside, they're generally that messed up on the inside. And so basically wrote us off. And my mother's, the pediatrician that was rounding for the newborns in the hospital came into my mother's room at the hospital after having this very traumatic birth experience, and asked her, what did she do to this baby? Well, what did she do to cause these issues in her child? And my mother basically told her to take a long walk off a short pier. So after a little while, we found out that Paul Rudishan was on the Today Show. And when I was like 2 or 3 years old, they found out that, well, he came on TV, and he was an American veteran who was dying of stomach cancer at that time. And he basically said that he had died in Vietnam and didn't know it. And it had to do with his exposure to Agent Orange. And that started the ball rolling of understanding what was happening to my family. My mother went on to have another miscarriage between my brother and I. And then my brother was born in 1978, and he was born without birth defects. So, and that's what we see in Vietnam too. They'll have families who have had exposures within their families, and some, you know, a line of children are born perfectly fine, and then you have a couple of children that have issues, and so on and so forth. My father used to liken it to Russian roulette. So he never really knew what was going on. So my parents became activists, and then later on, as I matured and was older, my father, unfortunately, when he was 38 years old, he started having heart problems. He had a bypass done on his heart at age 38. And at age 50, unfortunately, he died of a massive heart attack at age 50 in 1998. By that time in 1998, they had started to discuss Agent Orange more as a legitimate cause for the poisoning of Vietnam veterans. And my father was able to apply for Vietnam or VA compensation. However, nothing that he had was recognized until 2011. And so my mother had to basically sprint to be able to get through her life after losing her husband in 1998 when she was only 50 years old. After having many, many years of struggle and sickness and illness where my father wasn't able to be his full potential as a steelworker, and he was working because of his heart condition. So one of my biggest challenges when I became of age was understanding that passion that you have to change things can become such a wonderful motivator, but it also can become a very difficult burden to put on your shoulders, which is exactly what I did. I put a large backpack of passion and justice seeking into my backpack and said, I want to make a difference because there's so many of us who have no answers. Because as of now, the United States government does not recognize children of male Vietnam veterans as having issues from Agent Orange, except for spina bifida, and only one of the most rare forms of spina bifida. So while I was in my 30s, I started to see so many kids like me whose fathers had been in Vietnam, who had major health issues, who had major birth defects, their own children having issues that I knew I wanted to be a part. So and make a change. So with that passion in my belly, I helped to create Children of Vietnam Veterans Health Alliance. The problem is that when you are also suffering, it is very difficult to continue to hold that social justice flame in your heart for so long. And while I've done amazing things in the Agent Orange movement, I've met so many amazing people and have really felt connected to a community. In my heart of hearts, I always felt as though I wasn't able to meet my goals that I had, which were pretty unhumanly realistic as a one person against the U.S. government, and trying to make them come to a reckoning of what they have done to my family and what they had done to my peers. And so I think as I have reflected on my time as a Agent Orange activist, I would also come to understanding that the human heart, the understanding, the connection that we make with one another is really earnestly what is most important. And though we may not be able to physically change the absolute world, we are, like Ron showed in the video, able to spotlight and take time and honestly look at the challenges that we have as humans as we go through our suffering. And as of today, I believe that with everything going on in the world, it's really difficult to continue to push for wars that have been so long ago. But we must do it because the work that we do now reflects what will happen in the future in these current conflicts. And we need to choose peace, and we need to choose ways to uplift each other and to be more direct with our energy and causing communication and being able to limit the suffering of others. And so with that said, I just want to thank everyone for having me today, and I'll be available for questions. Thank you very much.
Well, are there any questions for Heather?
Yeah, Heather, your mom wasn't affected. She wasn't over there, right? But it was just she was affected because her husband died and caring for the kids without him. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. My mother was not a Vietnam veteran. My mother and father married 9 days before Dad went to Vietnam, and she was not affected. However, there has been some small research studies and some anecdotal evidence that some women have stated that they contracted uterine cancers and things like that after their husbands came home and they started children. However, I'm not really sure about that. But my mother's suffering came from trying to keep a family together with my father who had PTSD and then trying to manage all the issues with my health and well-being and our family's financial stability.
What my question was going to be really is like how longly sustainable is this in someone who's been exposed? And also transgenerationally, do you have kids? Could it show up again? Could it affect the genetic component of the person?
Yes. So what I have understood and what I've heard since I was a little girl in this work is that it's 7 generations. That's one of the things that had been said at the very beginning, and it's something that has continued to be said today. However, we really don't have a lot of information as to how dioxin will actually go through generations. However, when I did have children, I am married, and my husband and I waited 5 years to have children because we were concerned. At that point in time, I only had learned that, or I'd only known that people that like me, I thought mostly Agent Orange in children came out as missing limbs, missing fingers, that kind of stuff. I had no idea at the time, before the influx of the internet, as to how many children of Vietnam veterans had many disabling chronic ailments that like rheumatoid arthritis, cancers, these kinds of things, autoimmune diseases, all of these kinds of things. I had no idea. But my husband and I came to an understanding that we said, well, if our children are born without a leg or without a fingers, I feel like we can handle that. And so we went ahead and had children. And I will tell you that leading up into that first ultrasound, it was very, very worrisome, very scared, very, afraid. And thankfully, both of my children, I have 2 boys, one's now 23 and the other one is 18, and they're healthy, wealthy, and wise. Not wise yet. They're not wealthy yet. They're still living at home, so but that's okay.
Was there an ultrasound on you? Did you have an ultrasound on you, your mom?
Yes.
And what year were you born?
My mother did not have an ultrasound because that wasn't available.
What year were you born?
1972.
Okay. Because I'm an ultrasound tech and I started about 1980.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm an ultrasound tech and I started about 1980 doing it.
Oh, yeah.
But that was an early stage. And I just wondered like what kind of anomalies would show up that could be seen. And then, the person has an option to have an abortion.
Correct.
But,
that was one of my hardest things when I went to Vietnam for one of my first times, and I think 2011. Is at that point in time, it's still very common at that point in time to be having ultrasound tech businesses on the streets for people in Vietnam regarding children and deformities. And it was a common occurrence for Vietnamese women to get multiple ultrasounds and things. And it made me so sad because I thought about the idea of like, well, what would have happened had my mother had an ultrasound, and would I be here, or would many of my peers in Vietnam be here? And so, yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you for the question.
Any more questions for Heather? Okay, well, Heather, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, next we're going to hear from Susan Hammond. And Susan is the daughter of a U.S. Vietnam veteran, and she became interested in post-war Southeast Asia after traveling to Vietnam and Cambodia in 1991. In 1996, after earning her MA in International Education from New York University, Susan returned to Vietnam to study Vietnamese. She became involved in fostering a mutual understanding between the people of the U.S. and Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and addressing the long-term impacts of war while working as the Deputy Director of the Fund for Reconciliation and Development from 1996 to 2007. During this time, she lived in New York, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. coordinating programs for the FRD. In 2007, Susan returned to her home state of Vermont and founded the War Legacy Project to address the long-term health and environmental impacts of the war, especially the impacts of Agent Orange. In 2019, she received the Vietnam Order of Friendship Medal for her more than 2 decades of work in Vietnam. So, Susan Hammond.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to Boulder. We don't have quite these high mountains in Vermont as we do here, but it's nice to be back in Colorado. I first made my first trip to Vietnam back in 1991 in order to try to understand what it was about that country that took my father away from me for 2 years of my life when I was a child. I really remember him the first time when I was about 5. I want to know, why did we need to send more than 3 million Americans off halfway across the world to a country that had not attacked us, and then to have that 50,000 Americans not come home? I wanted to understand why we needed to, I'm having touch screen, so there we go. I wanted to find out why we needed to drop more than 7.5 million tons of bombs on Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, more than double that we dropped on all of Asia and Europe during World War II. In Laos alone, over 2.5 million tons of bombs were dropped. As my colleagues at an organization called the Legacies of War point out, that's the equivalent of more than a bomb every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 years. I also wanted to know why the US needed to spray over 20 million gallons of herbicide, 2/3 of which were Agent Orange, contaminated with dioxin, over South Vietnam, along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, and in parts of Cambodia. The environmental destruction at the time of the war was so great that Arthur Galston at Yale University coined the term ecocide to describe it. The Vietnam that I visited in 1990 was extremely poor. I recall seeing children climb over into the really filthy canals to scavenge pieces of vegetables that the vendors had thrown over the sides because they were just too poor quality to sell. But children were gathering them to bring home to their families. Vietnam's recovery from the war was greatly hindered, of course, by the US trade embargo that limited access to international markets and restricted international development aid after the war. Through 1991, the US did begin, though in 1991, the US did begin efforts to normalize relations with Vietnam, as well as with Cambodia and Laos. And the roadmap for normalization at the time, part of it required that Vietnam help the US recover the more than 2,500 US missing in action in those 3 countries. This cooperation on MIAs began in Vietnam in the late 1980s, and progress on the recovery of MIAs over the next several years, not only in Vietnam, but then later in Laos and Cambodia, led to building of trust between the 2 governments. And it ordered the 2 enemies to begin to work together on other war legacy issues, such as unexploded ordnance and later Agent Orange. But we must first thank Senator Patrick Leahy, my senator from Vermont, who sadly retired last year, for much of this. One of his first votes in Congress was in 1975, was to end the funding to South Vietnam for the war. Senator Leahy enabled the first post-war contribution of $1 million to Vietnam in 1991 through the Leahy's War Victims Fund to help provide prosthetic devices to those who had lost limbs due to the war and from unexploded ordnance. This support from the Leahy War Victims Fund later expanded to Vietnam, to Cambodia and Laos. And it's because of Senator Leahy and his staff person, Tim Reeser, who's also in this photo, that we are able to get all this funding over the last 20 years to address war legacies in Vietnam. But getting to the point where we are today in US funding to UXO, and especially for Agent Orange, was extremely difficult. It took a lot of effort from many organizations and individuals. In 1996, the Vietnam film director Tran Van Thuy made a film called A Story from the Corner of the Park. If you have ever a chance, I suggest you watch it. It tells a story of a family in Hanoi that had 2 disabled children, and this is one of them, that's his son, after his father returned from the fighting in the South. In a letter introducing this film to an American audience, Twee quoted the Russian poet Konstantin Simonov, not sure how to say it, "Suffering never belongs to just one person alone." And Twee noted that this indeed is a lofty thought, but I'm afraid it only serves to ease people's minds. I believe the truth of life is crueler. In real life, those who suffer, those who are unlucky, carry the burden themselves. So in this work, talking about his film, The Victims of Agent Orange, we work first of all, perhaps ease our own conscience, work first for ourselves. And this resonated with me when I founded the War Legacies Project to address the long-term health and environmental impacts of war. In order to address what my country had created, the impacts my country has caused. So perhaps I'm trying in some ways to ease my conscience, to help myself more than I'm able to help those in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Nearly 50 years since the end of the war, much has changed in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And today, most of the population, majority of the population, was born after the war ended. Their economies are some of the fastest growing in Southeast Asia. On the surface, it would appear that their war was long over. But for those who live in the rural area, in the areas that were heavily bombed or were sprayed by Agent Orange, their lives are still impacted by the war. Up to a third of the cluster munitions that were dropped did not explode. In Laos alone, there are over 80 million unexploded bombs like these, still capable of causing damage and injury and death more than 50 years later. Since the end of the war, there's been over 220,000 casualties from UXOs in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. 40% of those died. The remaining 130 or so thousand are living, like we saw in the film, with missing limbs, with blindness, brain damage, and other injuries that impact not only them, but also their families. Since 1993, the U.S. has provided over $750 million to address the legacies of explosive remnants of war. However, to put this in context, this is just about 3 days of the total of the cost of the U.S. to wage that war in Vietnam. It was over $1 trillion, and in today's dollars, it's over $1 trillion. So that's 750. It's a small amount of what we paid. Nonetheless, the funding has been essential to provide assistance to victims, as well as to conduct mine risk education programs, like we saw in the film, for school children, so they learn not to pick up these bombs. Much of the funding has been used to clear villages and farmland of unexploded ordnance. But much more funding is needed to help organizations like Project Renew to ensure that people are able to walk to school, to farm, to start a fire without fear of it blowing up. Just this past August in Laos, a 10-year-old boy and a 5-year-old girl were killed when one of their family members picked up a piece of old mortar that they thought was just scrap metal. 2 other children were also injured in that explosion. These accidents are still happening today. Addressing the legacy of Agent Orange was a much more difficult issue to address. This has been an uphill struggle. Beginning with the U.S. even refused to acknowledge that Agent Orange had any impacts on Vietnam. In fact, as we heard from Heather, they refused to acknowledge it had impacts on our own veterans. I remember many years ago visiting this family. This is Mrs. Swan with 2 of her first children and her husband, Mr. Baugh. They had 5 children. 1 son had already died. The oldest daughter was married and living away from home. They had another son who had severe cognitive disabilities and was living at home with them. And they had these 2 twin boys born in 1982 who had been bedridden like this and in terrible pain since their birth. Mrs. Swan explained to me her routine that every day it would take about 2 hours for her to prepare and feed every single meal to that child. So that's 6 hours of her day just feeding her children. And then she would clean the floor underneath this bed that they're sitting on, because that's these young boys' toilet. They had nowhere else to go. So bathing and cleaning took hours. She had no time to help her husband out in the field. She couldn't go to the markets. They have very extremely poor family, that they didn't have any money for emergencies, they couldn't fix their leaky roof, and they often ran out of rice before their next harvest. She also could barely sleep at night because she would sleep in between those two boys, and they would have seizures and toss and turn all night long.
How old are they in that image?
That image, they're born in 82. This image was from 2013, so can't do that.
21.
21 at that. So that need to ease my conscience from what the U.S. did and that war in Vietnam, it really hit me hard after this visit. But thanks to the early work of people like Lady Borton, Chuck Searcy, who you saw in that film, who a group in Canada called the Hatfield Group, Charles Bailey, who used to work at the Ford Foundation, and many others who worked to advocate for the U.S. to address the impacts of Agent Orange, we finally started to get to the bottleneck that was holding back progress. But our work would not have been successful at all if we didn't have all of our Vietnamese colleagues, doctors and scientists and veterans, who were also working on their end with their government to address the impacts of Agent Orange. On the environmental side of the issue, that Hatfield group from Canada were very essential in getting progress so that the US and Vietnam can finally start to work together on this issue. Hatfield did research in areas of Vietnam that had been sprayed by Agent Orange, and they found that the sprayed areas no longer have dioxin contamination. The problem is the air bases where US stored all of these chemicals. And they would be considered Superfund sites if they're here in the US. And once it became, the Vietnamese understood that their whole country was not contaminated, and the US understood it was limited to a handful of bases, the two sides could begin to work together on the environmental aspect. And so for the past 12 years, the US and Vietnam have been cleaning up the Bien Hoa and Da Nang Air Base, and they've allocated over $340 million since 2011 to do this. But when it came to assistance to people impacted by Agent Orange, the health impacts, that's where it gets very tricky, because it's if you hit a UXO and you lose a limb, it's very clear the cause. Agent Orange, as we were discussing, it's very difficult to pinpoint that exact birth defect to Agent Orange. But the US veteran, and it took a long time for the veterans to get to this point where these now 19 different conditions receive benefits from the VA if they have one of these conditions, other than stroke, that's not yet on the list. But if they have one of these illnesses and were in an area where Agent Orange was used, they can receive benefits. It took a very long time to get to that point. And as Heather mentioned, only spina bifida in the children of Vietnam veterans is allowed to be compensated by the VA. Unless you are one of the 8,000 women who served in Vietnam, and if you have a child with one of these birth defects, then your child could potentially receive benefits from the VA. The Vietnamese see all of these various birth defects, plus many more, as associated with exposure to Agent Orange.
Those twins probably had achondroplasia, dwarfism.
They could very well.
I don't know what else. Just
and so, but it took a long time to get the US to even mention in the same sentence Agent Orange and disabilities. For the long time, the US Embassy was not even allowed, their staff were not even allowed to talk about it to us, or to anyone, especially to the Vietnamese. But again, thanks to Senator Leahy, he was able to direct funding, because he was the head of the Appropriations Committee, he was able to direct funding to areas in Vietnam that were heavily sprayed with Agent Orange to help people with severe disabilities. So though they did say it was a direct cause and effect, he made sure the money got to that population in that area that were heavily impacted by the spraying. So far, the US has allocated, there we go, So far, the US has allocated over $139 million for disability work, and this $336 million for cleaning up of dioxin. In Laos, I've been working there as well to try to get the US to admit that Agent Orange was used there. And so far, the US has allocated $3 million for people in areas of Laos that have disabilities where Agent Orange was sprayed. But that was allocated starting in 2021, but our embassy is kind of dragging its feet on programming that funding. However, the funding only helps a very small percentage of the people in Vietnam who are considered by the Vietnamese and by others as victims of Agent Orange. For the most part, it doesn't reach those in the rural areas. It doesn't reach families like Boz, whose children have severe disabilities that this medical intervention is too little too late. It's physical therapy needed to start early on. They were not receiving it. And most of the funding from the US is going to physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy, all great programs, but they're not helping those that it's too late for, or who lives too far away to access those services. So therefore, my organization focuses on those families who do not have access to this, for medical intervention is too late. So we work to provide direct assistance to the families in the form of livelihood support, fixing their houses, maybe scholarships for siblings who will then later become the caregivers for their disabled siblings, and therefore need to have a good education, good job to take care of that, take over from their parents when the parents sadly pass on. And much of this work is funded by a Vietnam veteran and his family. Well, actually, the family of a Vietnam veteran named Bob Feldman, who passed away from his own Agent Orange-related cancer back in 2006. And over the past more than 15 years now, family and friends have contributed to our work in Vietnam to reach over almost 600 families now who have caring for these severely disabled children. In Laos, we work with those who live on villages along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. However, in Laos, our work is mainly focused on medical care because these people who live in these remote areas have had no access at all. And so we find 16, 20, even 30-year-old people with cleft lip or cleft palates that, if they had been in Vientiane Chen or in Vietnam, would have been addressed when they were born or shortly thereafter. So there we work with getting them access to medical care, like this young boy, Van, who we first met in 2014, who had severe clubfoot that he could not walk at all. His father was able to get him to Vientiane Chen with us and stayed there it was over 6 months for him to have a series of surgeries to repair his club feet. And now he's gone back to his village and he's running around on the soccer field with all of his peers that you wouldn't even know that he had any type of birth defect. Or another girl we work with in Laos, Yen, when we first met her here in 2014, she was extremely malnourished. Her mother wanted to kill her when she was a child because she had these severe, we believe is arthrogryposis. Arthrogryposis, yeah. So thank you. And she had severe limb deformity, so she couldn't walk, couldn't use her hands very well. We were able to get her to Vientiane Chen for a few surgeries that helped a little bit. She still has some severe physical disabilities, but she was able to go to vocational training school where she learned some independence. She learned a skill that she could earn a little bit of money doing making handicrafts. And she now lives in Vientiane Chen, and she's come a long way from her village where she probably would have died before the age of 16. She was living literally on, according to her, on what little bit of rice she could get and chilies. That was her diet. She had very unlikely she would have lived to much older than she is in this first photo of her. So these are just two examples of lives that can be changed with the right amount of support and resources. So we've come a long way since I started working on this in the last 25 years. The job is not complete. The US really needs to begin to invest more than a small fraction of what it costs to wage war in order to address its impacts. It's not only essential for the post-war recovery of those we sent to war and the recovery of the people and nations where we waged the war, but is vital for the long-term security of the US to make peace with our foreign enemies. Thank you.
Yeah. We will take questions now.
What's the name of your organization again? It's called the War Legacies Project. Yeah, very descriptive of what we do.
Do you direct it from here or how?
I'm based in Vermont. So yeah, I direct it in Vermont. We don't have a large staff. We have a few people who work for us in Laos. One is a volunteer. And then there's, we work directly with Vietnamese organizations who work in Vietnam, who mainly the Quang Nam Red Cross, the Hue School of Medicine, and a few other organizations who we develop projects with, but they do all of the management of it. We don't want to spend that much money on staff and overheads. Why do that?
Yeah, thank you for all your good work on the presentation. You mentioned a number of different movements that work on this issue, and some individuals such as this Bob Feldman. Is there an umbrella organization that puts them together? And if not, are there different missions? And you see the issue in different ways. Is there a division of labor on this? The organizations overseas?
Yeah.
You know, and you mentioned Canada, but I assume maybe Australia or some other countries. I mean, how does this come together from civil society?
It's pretty loosely organized. It's I mean, a lot of the people who've been, particularly those focusing on the Agent Orange issue, have been involved with Vietnam for decades. The lady Gordon, who I mentioned, she was in that photo with Zap, and Chuck Searcy has been living in Vietnam for 25, 30 years now at this point. So a lot of the some of it actually came out of the religious organizations who set up and started working in Vietnam right after the war, and based in Laos but working in Vietnam. The American Friends Service Committee, also the Quakers, Mennonite Central Committee. They are actually the first ones to bring MAG, one of the demining groups, into Laos to address the unexploded ordnance side of the question. But no, we really don't. I mean, we all communicate with each other, but it's pretty loose. There's another organization called the Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign, which is it's a project out of the Veterans for Peace, and their approach to it is to raise awareness through trying to get introducing legislation in Congress to get not only funding for people in Vietnam who've been impacted, but the children of veterans and the veterans who have not had their particular conditions addressed yet, and also address the environmental impacts. So they do this, they introduce, and they've been introducing it through Barbara Lee, but they know that is going nowhere, particularly in our Congress now, but even in past Congresses. It's a piece of legislation that involves 5 or 6 different committees in Congress, and we know that's destined to fail right there. But they do it to raise awareness.
Any more questions?
Oh, that's another question.
Sure.
Yeah, I've worked in another part of the world, in Southern Africa, and one of the greatest issues there, the most difficult, is to deal with psychological trauma. People who've really suffered. And so after the war of liberation in Mozambique, there were a number of people who were traumatized. The Mozambicans really did not have their own psychiatrists and psychologists and so on, who were equipped to deal with this, particularly children. So there were a number of organizations and medical schools, such as Duke University, that sent people over to train local people who know the culture and very well versed in the languages of the country, to try to help people come out of the trauma. Has this been an issue with the Vietnamese who've been affected by Agent Orange?
It's been, yeah, a huge issue, but very little is happening. There are a few I know that have started to do some projects. Some Vietnamese now, of course, have gone on to study psychology and work on trauma issues, but very little. And in Laos, even fewer. A lot more of that happens in Cambodia with Cambodian organizations dealing with the trauma of the Khmer Rouge era. So there's a lot more focus on that than I'm aware of in Vietnam or Laos, and not necessarily for Agent Orange, but just trauma of war in general, which is significant.
Anyone else?
I just have a couple of asides, kind of. I mentioned that another one. You said I worked for the American Red Cross in Vietnam from 69 to 70. And the Red Cross was asked by the military to send women over to boost morale. It's our job. And I remember one place I was living, we were in a Quonset hut, in our shower had an orange barrel on top of it that the water for our showers came out of. And I know some of the women that were there had died. And there's no studies about it, it's just incidental information basically, but there's no, we have no benefits. There's no, we weren't in the military, but the military asked us to be there. And the other little aside is that when I came back, I wanted peace. So I worked for the governor, the president. And Chuck Searcy was also worked with me on the government. So 72. So Chuck has just been an amazing guy since he was a kid, like me.
Yeah, no, that is true. And I mean, there's of course people who work for USAID and in the International Voluntary Services and others who were in Vietnam at the time who also would not qualify for any benefits from the US government. They would have to sue the US government to get those benefits, and it's almost impossible. So could sue the US government, but they have to agree. So it's almost impossible to do that. So I mean, if it was a fully orange barrel, it probably wasn't Agent Orange, because Agent Orange was a barrel that had a stripe around it that was orange. But there's certainly, those barrels were reused on every single air base, or every single base. They were used for barbecues, they were used for showers, they were used to store water. They were sold off to the local market for people to use as well. I mean, we had, millions and millions and millions of these barrels. I mean, it's 20 million gallons, and each barrel was a 5-gallon drum. So do the math to figure out how many millions were there. And they were reused constantly, because at the time, I mean, the chemical companies knew that they were contaminated with dioxin. The U.S. government is debatable who in the government knew, but the average soldier in Vietnam had no idea.
So what about penetration into the water, the long term and the longevity of the toxin itself in the water supply?
Yeah,
well, and it's diluted. How diluted? Can you trace it?
Dioxin is not water soluble, so it would not remain in the water itself. But what happens was that water would move the dioxin. It would stick to particles of soil and sediment.
That's like plutonium for soil.
Yeah. And so it would, it's no, I mean, we don't really know the full half-life of dioxin in the environment because it really depends on the environmental factors of where it is. But it's in the hundreds of years for certain. So once it's, particularly if it's underneath the level of the soil, if it's sitting right on top, like right on top of this book, and the sun is penetrating onto it, eventually it would be broken down. But that's not what happens. It gets underneath the soil. It gets in the sediment, and then what happens is the animals absorb it through their eating the little bits and things on the soil and the sediment. It gets, and it bioaccumulates in the fish and the ducks, and we eat those ducks, and that's where we get. If you're not directly exposed to the spraying, you can be exposed through the dioxin that's within the animals that it's bioaccumulating, and that's why the U.S. is spending $330 million now to clean out these hotspots, to prevent it from entering the food chain in the areas around spaces. Though we're not really cleaning up our own bases here in the US, where we also have dioxin and many other chemicals from the war industry.
Just out of curiosity, you know when your father was stationed?
I do.
And what years?
Yeah, he was in Saigon, and he was not in combat. He was an Army Corps engineer, so he was in Saigon in 1968, 67 through like May of 68. It was like November 67-ish through the Tet Offensive into October-ish, November-ish of 68. And then in Da Nang from 70 to 71. And in Da Nang, he was responsible for the Vietnamization of all of the military bases and building roads. So he still traveled to all the areas that were sprayed. And he kind of always gave us the impression that his job was, and he told me this, my job really was just to make sure that generals in Saigon had their ice for their drinks. Which is not what he did. I mean, he did do that, but he was in charge of all the military installations in Saigon as part of the Corps. And it wasn't until many, many, many years after I started working on this issue, going back and forth to Vietnam, that he came up to me one day and he put this piece of shrapnel on the table. And he said, "This nearly made your mother a widow with 7 kids." And what are you talking about? You were getting ice for the generals. And he said, "Well, not during the Tet Offensive." And he was coming back, driving up the road past the racetrack that was in Saigon, and which was one big area of the Tet Offensive. And the Jeep traveling in front of him got hit, and that piece of shrapnel just came right down right here. Missed his head by inches. He never gave us any indication there that he had seen, even though he was getting ice for the generals, that he had seen some dangerous stuff.
Did you say your dad died?
No. He said this piece of shrapnel.
Right, but I mean earlier I might.
Oh, he died of Parkinson's from his exposure to Agent Orange.
At what age?
He was 85, 83.
And I wonder how they attribute, Agent Orange versus a genetic predisposition.
It's through various epidemiological studies that are done. So I mean, it's like anything. You can't say he was precisely died from that. Right. I mean, it was his time in Vietnam,
or a percentage of it.
But it's one of the conditions that the VA will recognize. And for the question back to the birth effects, sorry, the sort of thought that scientists who are studying this now are believe that it's dioxin, because it mimics hormones. That's how it works in our body. That it's causing epigenetic changes, and that's how it can get transgeneration. So
through genes.
Yeah, through actually the layer of, so not the gene itself. It doesn't change like, whatever
DNA.
The DNA. What it does is it changes the epigenetic. How the epigenetic layer interacts with our genes. It's really quite complicated, but if you ever want to go into the science, the main person to sort of look at is a woman named Linda Birnbaum, who used to be with the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. She's recently retired. She's now at Duke University. She is the specialist when it comes to dioxin and its impacts and its hormone mimicking, and not just dioxins, but other persistent organic fluids. I mean, she is one who now is talking a little more openly about the research she did, because she couldn't, under the US government, say everything that she had learned. And she's now starting to say a little. But anyway, on to you.
Okay. Susan, thank you very much. And now we're going to hear from Linda Yar. And Linda is a research affiliate of the Center for Asian Studies at CU here in Boulder, and a research professor of international affairs at the George Washington University. As Director of Partnerships for International Strategies in Asia, she developed a joint research and professional development program with the universities in Vietnam. As a student in France, she was a member of the Paris Committee to Stop the War and led a dialogue between the Vietnamese and American students about the war in Vietnam. And so, Susan Yar, Linda Yar.
Well, thank you very much, Kurt. And boy, these vivid, personal stories are truly a hard act to follow, and I don't mean to in any way try to do so. What I'd like to do is certainly the issues of unexploded ordnance and Agent Orange exposure are the most difficult. They may be very intractable, but at the same time, they're visible in many ways. I'd like to take us to consider some of the other long-term consequences of the war in Vietnam. When I was telling a friend of mine that I was going to be working on this project, she lives in Germany, and she said, "Oh, I'm glad you're doing something like that. I have been helping Ukrainian refugees get settled in Germany, and there was this one little boy who would just jump with terror every time he heard an ambulance go by or a loud noise." These kinds of things will last for a long time, and also need to be recognized as we look toward, well, I must say, ever more wars, it appears. I'd like to broaden our consideration of the Vietnam War and essentially go into 5 different dimensions of its effects over the long term. I'll cover some of the physical and mental injuries that are prevalent. I'll talk a bit about one of the political impacts or societal impacts, and that is the loss of respect for government and what that does to us as a society. The economic impact was touched on a bit in Susan's presentation, but it was certainly profound. The environmental damage done in Vietnam in particular and in Southeast Asia generally needs to be considered. And finally, we can consider some of the broader geopolitical impacts of the war in Vietnam that still are effects that we feel today. Of the 2.7 million who served in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, 304,000 were wounded 58,220 were killed. And we can't forget the South Vietnamese soldiers, of whom 200 to 250,000 lost their lives. And of course, nearly 2 million, the numbers can be contested, but 2 million Vietnamese also suffered and were killed during the war. As Ron Haverly explained last week, young soldiers were participants or witnesses to horrendous acts of cruelty that accompanied the common order of so-called free fire zones, the order to kill anything that moves. Reintegration into American society was difficult at best for all soldiers, especially returning to a deeply divided country, divided in terms of politics about the war. But it's even more traumatic for those suffering from unbearable flashbacks and memories of post-traumatic stress syndrome, or PTSD. Others suffered interior wounds that can be ascribed to moral injury. At Syracuse University, they have a moral injury project and they define it as the damage done to one's conscience or moral compass when that person perpetrates, witnesses, or fails to prevent acts that transgress one's moral beliefs, values, or ethical codes of conduct. These are not wounds that are clearly visible, but I know here nearby in Boulder, there is a sculptor who has been working with veterans who return from more recent conflicts, and using art as a way to bring out some of this wound of moral injury.
What was his name?
I'm sorry, I don't have.
It's not Jamie.
Pardon?
I think I know that is.
Okay, which is better than I. When we think about the impact on our political culture, the fact that we learned through the release of the Pentagon Papers, through studies of how the Tonkin Gulf incident was in fact trumped up or manufactured to push or give an excuse for the expansion of the war. When we were the age of the age when young men would have been going into the army, we came out of a culture in which we saw a lot of movies about World War II. And of course, our soldiers were always the good guys. There was always a pride in what America was able to do, to counter the horrendous acts of World War II. So it was kind of a shock when many of the young men who went into the army at that time, came with this idea that they were going to be doing good for Vietnam, doing good for their country. I was surprised to learn that actually, during World War II, something like 2/3 of those who went to war were actually drafted, whereas of those who went to Vietnam, only 1/4 were drafted. More were were volunteers. And you don't think of that that way. So in a congressional budget study found that a disproportionate share of those who were drafted did go to Vietnam or to Southeast Asia. But 70% of those who were killed were actually volunteers. It's important to realize, I think, that nowadays, one says, well, during the Vietnam War, there were all these protests because of the draft. And in fact, it was, a large number of those who did go to Vietnam were volunteers. As the exhibit that you can visit down in Norman Library documents, the soldiers and sailors returning from Southeast Asia saw a disconnect between what they thought they were there to do and what they encountered. They shared that knowledge through protests, underground newspapers, music, and many means. The release of the Pentagon Papers, the Tonkin Gulf incident, the news of the secret bombings, the secret war in Laos, the secret bombings of Cambodia. All of this actually undermined the confidence and trust in what our government was capable of doing. As Craig McNamara, he's the son of Robert S. McNamara, the Secretary of Defense under President Johnson, that his memoir is titled "Because Our Fathers Lied," a memoir of truth and family from Vietnam and today. This feeling of being lied to is really undermined the confidence that youth had in what to expect from their government. The American expansion of the war and major deployment of troops in 1965 had a significant effect also on the U.S. economy as well as the global economy. The Johnson administration was initially given a budget by Secretary McNamara, saying that it would be, cost $10 billion to pursue the war in Vietnam. Well, it turned out to cost 100% more, or 20 billion. And this came at a time when the Johnson administration was trying to develop huge initiatives that would transform American society that had just gone through the throes of the civil rights movement. He initiated the war on poverty and what was called the Great Society. The first included such programs as affordable housing, the SNAP, which is also, as you know, called food stamp, Head Start preschool, federal work study programs. And he wanted to increase funding for public schools in disadvantaged areas. The Great Society encompassed Medicare, Medicaid, and such legislation as the Clean Water Act. The underestimation of the cost of the war should have been covered by a tax increase in, say, 1966. But the hope was, and the unrealistic hope was, to have guns and butter. Instead, the pressure on payments led to 6% inflation, a massive deficit in the balance of payment, and ultimately forced a devaluation of the dollar. It brought to an end the Bretton Woods system that had pegged the dollar to gold and offered stability in terms of foreign exchange on a global level. Economists don't just mention the cost of a given policy. They also investigate the opportunity cost. What been, what could the economy have afforded if billions were not drained to pay for the war and instead invested in more profitable ventures for the long term? The impact of the Vietnam War was, of course, I should mention, as Susan did, that estimates are that the war cost $1 trillion in today's dollars. But don't forget that compensation to vets and their families runs $2 billion, $22 billion a year. And remember that the very last recipient of a pension from the Civil War just died in 2020. So just 3 years ago, we're finally ended payments for the Civil War. Imagine how long we will be paying for the war in Vietnam, not to mention successive wars. Not that those payments aren't necessary, of course they are, and they should be increased. The impact on Vietnam, though, was of course far more severe. At the end of the war in 1975, as Susan mentioned, the U.S. Essentially punished Vietnam by extending an embargo. There had already been an embargo put in place, a trade embargo by Nixon against the northern part of Vietnam. But in 1975, when the country was reunified, Nixon imposed the embargo on the entire country. I mean, Nixon, but it's extended the trade embargo. I remember going to Vietnam in 1986, and it was very poignant to see in a hospital in Ho Chi Minh City, formerly Saigon, there was a kind of small structure at the hospital for drying out latex gloves. They were, they made these little structures with places to hold the fingers to air dry them. They had to be washed, sanitized, and reused over and over. So they had them drying out there just outside the hospital. The medical journals in the hospital ended in 1975. It was no longer possible for them to have access to the latest journals. And of course, the embargo, was essentially 30 years of no economic relations between our two countries. The poor economic progress of Vietnam and the poverty that one saw in the period between 1975 and 1986, what they call the subsidy period, it was often ascribed to their socialist economic policies, that they were being too radical and wanted to follow their ideology. But you can't dismiss the impact of the embargo, the environmental damage, the loss of all those men and women of working age. What does that do to an economy? How can one only ascribe it to economic policy? So this leads me to the fourth dimension of impacts of the war, and that is the environmental damage. Of course, Agent Orange had a tremendous impact on humans, but imagine what it did to the ecology of the country, with all the defoliation. You had the soil in a tropical forest. The soil layer is actually very thin. So much, all of the biomass is above. And the roots don't go very deep. It's very, very thin fertility of soil. So once the soil is laid bare, it becomes hard. It becomes laterite soil, and it becomes impossible to cultivate. Also, they have wonderful. There were wonderful trees that could be sold, could be harvested and sold, but they were also damaged by shrapnel. You couldn't run a saw through it because the trees would have shrapnel in them. Some of the, in addition to Agent Orange, the U.S. used these other more mechanical measures to clear the forest. They had things called roam plows, which would cut, a huge swath right through the forest. They had daisy cutter bombs. These are the biggest bombs that could have that would clear a path of enough ground for a helicopter landing pad. All of these were used on the environment in a way that certainly affected the Vietnamese ability to grow their economy. And of course, one of the areas that was also defoliated and cleared were the mangrove forests on swampy areas near the coast. These are the nurseries for fish. And when you clear those away, then again, you damage the fish stock that the population relies on for protein. So, finally, I'd like to look at some other ancillary issues that are more geopolitical than I'd say. We speak about the war in Vietnam as such, but as Susan has shown, the war was not restricted to Vietnam. There was extensive bombing in Agent Orange used in Laos and bombing in Cambodia. Certainly the heavy bombing in Cambodia is generally seen as one of the motivators that kind of pushed the rise of the Khmer Rouge and ended up with the devastating impact on that population. Susan just referred to how in Cambodia there's a little more concern about mental issues. And I remember going to Cambodia to Phnom Penh in 1995, and I was talking to a woman who had been a teacher there in the university, and she said, look, we were going down the street and there were people sort of sitting, and it looked so different from Vietnam, because in Vietnam, if you go down the street, you have a sense that everyone is adding value. Everyone is doing something, very busy. And there, people were just kind of sitting around. And she said, look, people are so traumatized, they just gaze. They're just looking in the distance. They don't have that kind of bustling energy that people in Vietnam had at the time. So talk about mental harm. It really was, it was striking in Cambodia. So this spread, into, you also have the fact that the United States government paid other countries to send their soldiers to fight in Vietnam, the Philippines. Thailand hosted an air base and also saw many of the soldiers come on rest and recreation leave. You had South Korea, sent many troops. And that payment to South Korea, is part of what jump-started their economy as they industrialized. When we think of this, of Thailand and, as being a place for rest and recreation, it was led to a huge jump in the sex trade, and it was really striking the extent to which that became a factor. So, I think that the Vietnam War actually kind of had the impact, at least in those early years after the war, of shattering the myth of American invincibility. And it ushered in a period of questioning and contestation over the use of military power, at least until the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Ultimately, as we're experiencing now with the controversy over buildings named after slaveholders or statues raised to officers of the Confederacy, it will fall to us to uncover the truth of the war in Vietnam, to disempower the myth-making, and to ensure that accurate memories of the war in Vietnam prevail and persist. Thank you all, and thank you all. Many of you I've seen at other events of this series. I really appreciate the opportunity for us to have this re-examination of the war in Vietnam here at Boulder.
Thank you so much. Any questions for the judge?
I would like to know, since you're involved on campus, why you think it's important for students?
Why is it important for students to understand the history of the Vietnam War?
Well, as I think that the Vietnam War was in many ways a kind of turning point for many of the leadership in our country today. And so an understanding that period and what happened both among civilians here in the United States, what was experienced by soldiers who went to Vietnam, what was experienced by the populations of Southeast Asia that were affected by the war, are hugely important for understanding who we are, what our values should be, what mistakes governments make, and how it's necessary to hold governments accountable. I.F. Stone, who was a famous journalist, at least when during those years, said all governments lie. And that's something that I think is important to keep in mind. Why do they lie, and how can we be both skeptical when necessary, but also work toward transformation, work with others as Susan is, as Heather is, to make sure that those lies, for whatever reason they're made, don't impact us in a bad way, but rather move us forward.
Did the U.S. government pay the Australian government for the Australian soldiers that came?
I believe, there were, I don't know that they paid them in in actual transfers, but it was quid pro quo policy issue.
But we actually paid the South Korean.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
The one thing I wanted to say, one, US didn't have just one base in China. They had five. I spent a year in China in 68, 69. There was also Vietnam and 71, 72. Okay, we had 5 fighter bases in Thailand. We also had 1 bomber base. About. We now have several smaller bases. This is not their intelligence. And then those are just the ones we know about. We have the most secret service. One is also the distrust in government. I mean, wasn't the Pentagon Papers enforcement. This is what was a huge shock because that was the first time that documents of such high classification had been published. For not just the United States, but the world. And of course, that's in shockwaves through the American political and military establishment. That many people said, I felt that is one of the things that led to Watergate and this is initial resignation. But that showed that and several other things showed how much we would belong to that war. That and other projects, I had no faith in the U.S. government. Also, just 73, and I've watched a whole series of so since then. Why started invasion. There's also the POW/MIH. Okay, the official story is that all of them were returned 503. I believe that was. I was at Andrews Air Force Base. I was at the Air Force, but I lived in Washington D.C. And I was at Andrews when the second one came back. At that time, I thought that was the official figure. But in the late 70s, early 80s, more refugees came back from various parts of Southeast Asia into the United States. These people were giving very clear and concise testimony to live American POWs. They had seen them. And when I was in Thailand, I worked mostly as an Indian specialist in the force. But I spent 3 months in debriefing. I was full of the shop. I spent 3 months in debriefing. When the pilots came back from missions, we had a series of questions to ask. And so I was familiar with a lot of survival techniques and things like that. Long story short, these were very credible. This was very credible. The U.S. government is definitely not. There's an excellent book called Perfect. There are a couple of one of them called Perfect.
PRFIDY?
Yeah, I got the authors here, but that is an excellent book about not only the fact that thousands were left, why they were left, but there's many people in this country. It's pretty awful things happening.
Does perfidy mean uncertain?
No, it means doing something very, very bad, very awful.
Oh, okay.
So I'll get you the author.
Yeah, I just want to sort of talk again sort of about the distrust, but I mean the Lao War you mentioned it's a secret war, and it's still classified today. It's been 50 years since the end of the war. The majority of what happened in Laos during that war is still classified because I've tried to get it released. But there's another book talking about books. It's called A Great Place to Have a War: American in Laos and the Birth of the Military CIA. And it's by Joshua Lancic. And it talks about how the Lao War, the secret war in Laos, led to many other CIA. I mean, during that, until Iraq, we certainly were engaged in many, many countries around the world, but it was a CIA-led fight and incursions and many other things. But anyway, that's an interesting book to look at, another sort of extension of what the Vietnam War did to our government and how we waged war.
Yeah. I want to just pile on to Linda's answer to the first question. Why is this important? I think I'm speaking for the whole series of events that you had. There's an attempt to erase memories. Yeah, and I think what's so important here, the lessons to be learned, is that recovering the memories can inspire other struggles, other resistance against unjust policies. I mean, I think that's the important filters. And then the question that comes out of this is really, how do you do memory research? And that's what this is, as I understand it. And memories are fallible. Yeah, and there are conflicts over memories. Just look at what's going on with the war in Ukraine today. You know, I mean, Putin has one memory, Ukrainians have another memory. And how do you really try to reconcile those? And this is a everlasting issue, because what we're dealing with are forever wars. It's perpetual war in the name of making peace. I remember when I turned on television during the Vietnam War, and the president told us, oh, the reason that we're going to Laos and the reason why we're bombing Cambodia is to bring peace to the region. You know, we're always talking about making peace, but in fact, what is happening is spreading wars. So this is the way that I see, you know, the larger importance of this, particularly the inspiration of the bravery, from the bravery and the courage of the people who dissented and resisted.
Yeah, when you, just to add to that, when you look at our history of our country, I can't remember now, but I mean, I guess I don't know how you calculate what we're funding of this war in Iraq, but I mean Iraq, wherever Ukraine. It's hard to keep them all track, but we've really been at peace for only a few dozen years in our history. We were either at war in our country against the Indian wars, overseas, funding other wars. I mean, in our 200 something now year history, it's a very small time of our history where we've been at peace.
I'd like to just say though, that I don't take the statement of all governments line is, I think, a clarion call to learn, to educate yourself, not to hide under a rock or say the heck with it, but rather to engage with other people in civil society to make sure that our elected officials are moving on in the direction that we need.
And that's not a legitimization. Since all governments lie, then we should lie too?
No.
That's pretty pitiful, you know?
That's not at all what I said.
Oh, well,
I'd say.
Yeah, I know, but you know, making that statement.
I'm sorry.
I mean, not you making that statement, but that predominant feeling of justification for war.
Oh, no, I know he was a very incredible investigative journalist. And the reason he said that all governments lie is as an impetus to investigate, to find the truth, to make sure that you learn, that you educate yourself. That is the value of that message.
Who is that person?
His name was Isidore F. He was called I.F. Stone.
Oh,
and he used to publish his newsletter. It might have been like a blog in today's media. Anyway.
But you know, on her question, I really like, because you know what we really need to think about is the finances of this. And I don't know about you, but you know, I own my house only by pure chance, and I'm 70. And folks today are never going to be able to afford to have a house if they're not, you know, independently wealthy. Many folks today. And the expense of these wars is getting so overcoming that it's overcoming the whole entire economy. And, you know, we're a world hedge fund and it works. You know, we can print money for so long until we can't anymore.
Right, Linda, thank you very much. I just have a couple of things I'd like to add to this whole thing since I was in Vietnam from May of '68 to April '69. And I was diagnosed with prostate cancer in 2009. And it happened that my ex-wife and I were going to update our insurance policy, so I had to take a blood test in the middle of the year. And the insurance company called back and said, we're not going to insure you, and we highly advise you see your doctor right away. And so in 2009, I was diagnosed, and it was advanced to the point where I had to have a prostatectomy. And I was not connected with the VA at the time. I didn't know it was VA connected, but I did find out later, like in around 2011, that it was then presumed. So I am receiving benefits from it. But I had a recurrence. It's recurred twice since. Once in 2016, I took a radiation treatment that lasted 30 days, and that kept it in remission until 2021. And when it came back the third time, they put me on a oral chemo program for 6 months. And then I did another radiation treatment to my whole body. And that's got it in remission now to this day. Of course, it's screwed up my body. You know, the cure was worse than the disease. Like, I never suffered any pain when I didn't know I had prostate cancer. But the radiation treatments totally wrecked my urinary setup, and it's very compromised right now. But I will say that I have nothing but compliments for the VA Health Department. I've got a oncologist, a urologist, dermatologist, and 12 people who just suck blood out of my arm. And they take really good care of me. And I appreciate the fact that I've been able to fight it for 14 years now, and you know, things are looking good. But it's something that you can't ever ignore or forget about. And the other thing I want to comment on is PTSD, because I got a little bit of that. I have a it's kind of like a Netflix streaming series that plays the 5 or 6 closest calls I had back over and over again in my head, you know, like daily. And, you know, a couple of the worst things that I saw that they're just unignorable. And I did find that my activities in the anti-war area were definitely cathartic to the point where I felt like I was doing something about it, and continue to do something about it. And I even wrote a memoir. Do you have my book? There's in the bag. Where's my bag? You have the bag. Oh. Called Steel Pot, and it's about the war, but it's also about the marijuana subculture that was first and birthed in the Vietnam War. And I firmly believe that the Vietnam War was the primary factor in the fact that marijuana is going to be legal in this country, from all of the GIs who encountered it over there, who never otherwise would have encountered it. And so writing this, it took me 14 years to write this, but it really helped with my mental feelings about everything. And you know, I know it's something that will never go away. You know, like once you've been shot at, you're shot at forever. You know, and I even think often about what the bullet sounds like coming by your head. It sounds like this. And that's thought I can't get out of my head most of the time. But I appreciate the fact that Ron Carver got his project together and his exhibit together to show what all of the GIs who experienced that, who felt compelled to do something about it, like what we did. And the reason that we have an all-volunteer army today is what we did. They're not going to put up with that again. And now you cannot protest in the army. They have rules now, since you're not a draftee. And Linda, what you were saying about a lot of people being volunteers, you know, not draftees. Well, the only reason I volunteered is because I got drafted. You know, and I took an extra year to try and get a better deal, and it landed me in the Vietnamese infantry for 5 months. So it was a win-lose situation. You know, like I didn't get a Purple Heart, and my wound came later, and I think my sons avoided my Agent Orange problems. So
So far, right.
Yeah. But I'd like to thank you all for attending today and thank our speakers and thank Ron Carver and have a nice evening.
And I can say one thing before you go. Thank you for writing that memoir because, like, I don't know about you, but it's maybe until he wrote that memoir, he probably didn't talk about the war at all to you.
Oh, we talked about all this stuff.
Oh, he did. Wow. Well, most veterans do not talk to their children about it.
Well, you know, I'm in the communication field.
Well, there you
And so that's different. I've been in communication all my life. So.
But most don't, and they keep it to themselves. And I mean, it's really important to share.
Well, you know, I also think it's important, like the experiences that you've had. I've always said that the demarcation on whether or not you really got screwed up or not was whether or not you had to kill someone. And I didn't. And I was very fortunate for that forever. And I tried to keep the PTSD out of my family's life, but every so often it goes out to deep end.
It turns out.
Oh, God.
Before we leave, I want to talk about another book which is available, which is the companion book to the exhibit. It's called Waging Peace in Vietnam, U.S. Soldiers and Veterans Who Opposed the War. You can find it online, and students can get it out of the library here for free. And I want to say one other thing about this issue of draftees and enlisted. You heard that there were many more enlisted, and as far as the protesters go, and I don't have statistics on this, and I don't think that they are available. But anecdotally, for the years I spent with the GI movement 50 years ago and the last 7 years with this exhibit and putting together the exhibit, it's my sense that the vast majority of the soldiers and veterans that you see in our exhibit and you see in this book who were protesting the war were enlistees. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that most of them enlisted because people, their families before them had, their fathers, their grandfathers. One of them, Bill Short, who did a lot of the photos in the book and the exhibit, traces people back to the Revolutionary War and his family who served. But then when they went to Vietnam and saw what was going on, and they were distressed and shocked, they felt betrayed, and that created such a passion within them that when they got back to this country, they were determined to build a new anti-war movement within the military. And it was that passion. And there's an example within this book of Paul Cox, who experienced witnessing his own, he calls it his own mini My Lai, where his group of troops he was with slaughtered 15 innocent civilians, mostly women and children. He was enraged by this. There were no enemies there. There were no Viet Cong. There were no people with arms in that little village. And when he came back, he was a Marine infantryman. When he came back to the Marine base, Camp Lejeune on the East Coast, he created an underground newspaper called Rage to express his rage. He opened up outside of the base while he was still in the Marines, a bookstore which served as the coffee house for him. So I think that's important to understand, and that's why ending the draft is really going to solve the problems for this country when we get into other unjust wars. One last quick comment is a lot of the information of that exhibit and in this book are the covers of the underground papers that the GIs created when they came back with all kinds of, it's very, very decentralized. So you had Rage that Paul Cox and his friends created. You have Above Ground, which was the underground paper that Kurt Stocker and his colleagues created at Fort Carson in Colorado Springs. Well, isn't it interesting? We should appreciate that this collection of underground papers, of the coffee houses, of the protests, the parades, the soldiers who went into exile rather than continue and to be part of the war in Vietnam. Where's all this shown here on campus? These underground papers at the Underground Gallery. That's the name of the gallery in the library here. So with that, I say good night and thanks everybody for your participation.